Welcome to Kairos Research Center podcast, Christian faith seeking understanding, intellectual witness, and spiritual renewal.
Okay, Kam Ming, I have a question for you. I want to, first of all, quote what you have mentioned just now. You were talking about Paul being instrumental in advocating that faith in Jesus Christ, not adherence to Jewish law. And you say that this perspective was pivotal in shifting Christianity from an ethnic, law-based religion to an inclusive, faith-based religion for all people, regardless of their culture or ethnic background, close quote. So my question is this, you see, because some critics, precisely because of this point, right, they say that Paul's teaching actually contradicts Jesus' teaching. I give you an example. Example goes like this. For example, Paul teaches that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law, Romans 3:28. However, Jesus teaches obedience to the law. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophet, but to fulfill them, Matthew 5:17-19. So how do you answer this kind of so-called contradiction?
Okay, this is a very difficult question, man. Let's see. Let me just begin by saying that Paul certainly agrees with Jesus in the spirit when he took the gospel to the Gentiles. Remember the Great Commission? Jesus said, "Go and make disciples of all nations." That should include both Jews and Gentiles. But of course, the question is, people say, in the process, Paul could have distorted what Jesus taught and invented a new religion. Let's call it Paulinism. Well, I can answer it in a number of ways. First of all, Paul's self-understanding was that he wasn't preaching anything apart from what he has received from Jesus Christ in his Damascus revelation, you may say. So, Paul's gospel originated from the revelation of Jesus. It was not his personal innovation. Just also note that Paul, for all his preaching, using the Greek language, and there was always the agreement between he and the Jerusalem apostles. Of course, some of the German critics would like to play Paul against Jerusalem, the F.C. Bauer and gang, in the 19th century. But read the gospel. Paul says in Galatians 2:6-9, he presented the gospel to the apostles in case he finds out that he has preached the gospel in vain. But he says, they added nothing to me. We had the same gospel. And then he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, he says, I delivered to you what I also received from the early Christian tradition, that Christ died for our sin and that he was raised on the last days. So in that sense, Paul was always faithful to the same message that he received by revelation, which was confirmed in his discussion with the Jerusalem apostles. So, and I think we must also make a difference that when you talk about the law, Paul and Jesus were asking different questions. When Jesus talked about the law, he was reminding the Jews that the covenant that God gave, life under the covenant, was centered around the requirements of the law, life within the covenant. And in that sense, to the extent that Jesus fulfilled all the requirements, all the demands of God and the law on the cross, he fulfilled the gospel, fulfilled the law. Paul, on the other hand, was interpreting, opening up new understanding of the law after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yes, the law itself outwardly may seem to require strict outward observance, but Paul notes that in the light of Jesus' death, we should focus on the spirit of the law, which was fulfilled by Jesus Christ. And insofar as the law is relevant to the new believers, the Christian, it was not a means of salvation, but Christ has done that. But the law remains, if you read Paul, the law remains important for Christians, for believers. Why? Because it expresses God's will. The law now becomes the guide and the standard of Christian obedience. Faith which issue in obedience is guided and measured by what God has revealed in the Old Covenant. So they are answering the question in different perspective. And so for people who claim that there is division between Paul and Jesus, should take note of the hermeneutics, understand that Jesus and Paul were different in different contexts, but the spirit remained the same. And all of it, if I may say, follow what Paul says, that Christ is the end of the law insofar that the telos, he brought to the final fulfillment what the law is intended to achieve. And that Christ did it through his death and resurrection. And Paul affirmed the same. Thank you.